Do you know who Amory Lovins is? Nobody. Amory Lovins is an unusual character. He is something of polymath. Just say, he has varied, sort of, knowledge across a wide range of fields. He's not an academic. He actually has a consulting company which he runs until recently out of his home in Colorado. He lives beside Snowmass in a house built into the side of a mountain that has no furnace. For about 30 years, he has been kind of iconic plastic oddball genius. Thinking of ways to save energy. Thinking of ways to solve problems using technology that already exist. And he has demonstrated several of them. He also offers he is something that he is such an oddball that people tend to think he is kind of crazy. Anyway, Elizabeth Colbert went to spend some time with Amory Lovins. And so, she has written this piece called Mr. Green.
As long as industrialized nations consume energy and developing countries increase their fossil fuel consumption, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will continue to rise. Researchers predict that temperatures will increase about 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. What's less certain is what rising temperatures mean for the planet. Some climate models predict subtle changes. Others forecast rising sea levels which could flood coastal areas around the world. Weather patterns could change, making hurricanes more frequent. Severe droughts could become more common in warm areas, and species unable to adapt to the changing conditions would face extinction. Although much remains to be learned about global warming, many organizations advocate cutting greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the impact of global warming. Consumers can help by saving energy around the house, switching to compact fluorescent light bulbs, and driving fewer miles in the car each week. These simple changes may help keep the Earth cooler in the future. In the United States and other industrialized countries, many consumers are making green choices in their behavior and purchases that reflect concern for the environment. In some cases, these choices carry a price tag, such as paying more for organically grown food or for clothing made from organic cotton. Consumers are also motivated to make green purchases that save money. For example, after gas prices topped 4 per gallon in 2008, sales of gas-guzzling SUVs dropped, and sales of more fuel-efficient cars, such as hybrids, increased. Consumers often consider their utility bill when they choose energy-efficient appliances and electrical equipment.
In nearly all human populations, a majority of individuals can taste the artificially synthesized chemical phenylthiocarbamide, PTC. However, the percentage varies dramatically from as low as 60 in India to as high as 95 in Africa. That this polymorphism is observed in non-human primates as well indicates a long evolutionary history which, although obviously not acting on PTC, might reflect evolutionary selection for taste discrimination of other, more significant bitter substances, such as certain toxic plants. A somewhat more puzzling human polymorphism is the genetic variability in earwax, or cerumen, which is observed in 2 varieties. Among European populations, 90 of individuals have a sticky yellow variety rather than a dry, gray one, whereas in northern China these numbers are approximately the reverse. Perhaps like PTC variability, cerumen variability is an incidental expression of something more adaptively significant. Indeed, the observed relationship between cerumen and odorous bodily secretions, to which non-human primates and, to a lesser extent humans, pay attention suggests that during the course of human evolution genes affecting body secretions, including cerumen, came under selective influence.
One of the questions of interest in the study of the evolution of spiders is whether the weaving of orb webs evolved only once or several times. About half the 35,000 known kinds of spiders make webs. A third of the web weavers make orb webs. Since most orb weavers belong either to the Araneae or the Euloboridae families, the origin of the orb web can be determined only by ascertaining whether the families are related. Recent taxonomic analysis of individuals from both families indicates that the families evolved from different ancestors, thereby contradicting Wheely's theory. This theory postulates that the families must be related, based on the assumption that complex behavior, such as web building, could evolve only once. According to Coleman, web structure is the only characteristic that suggests a relationship between families. The families differ in appearance, structure of body hair, and arrangement of eyes. Only euloborids lack venom glands. Further identification and study of characteristic features will undoubtedly answer the question of the evolution of the orb web.
Although the development of new infrastructure is usually determined by governmental planning, sometimes this development can be planned more flexibly and realistically by private investors who anticipate profit from the collection of user fees. Such profits can contribute to the financing of more infrastructure if demand proves great enough, whereas the reluctance of developers to invest in such projects can signal that additional infrastructure is not needed. During the economic boom of the 1980s, for example, the state of Virginia authorized private developers to build a $300 million toll road. These developers obtained the needed right-of-way from property owners, but by 1993 they still had not raised the necessary financing. The unwillingness of investors to finance this project does not negate the viability of privately financed roads, rather, it illustrates a virtue of private financing. If a road appears unlikely to attract enough future traffic to pay for the road, then it should not be built.
Reviving the practice of using elements of popular music in classical composition, an approach that had been in hibernation in the United States during the 1960s, composer Philip Glass, born 1937, embraced the ethos of popular music without imitating it. Glass based two symphonies on music by rock musicians David Bowie and Brian Eno, but the symphony's sound is distinctively his. Popular elements do not appear out of place in Glass's classical music, which from its early days has shared certain harmonies and rhythms with rock music. Yet this use of popular elements has not made Glass a composer of popular music. His music is not a version of popular music packaged to attract classical listeners. It is high art for listeners steeped in rock rather than the classics.
We are led to believe that basically much of eastern North America was heavily cloaked in mature forest that today we covet as old growth, and yet at one time it was the sort of ancestral, botanical blanket that covered much of certainly Massachusetts and New England. Certainly one of the first things that happened as increasing waves of colonists arrived was the need to clear the land, and this clearing of the land is something that started, really in the form of small, subsistence farms. The timber was used for building houses, for building ships, for firewood, for all manner of things. The boulders, the erratic, the glacial erratic stones that were so much a part of the New England landscape, are today sort of what we find in the latticework of stone walls that one can find practically anywhere in the landscape. If it's in a relatively untouched condition. Ellipsis. By the early part of the 19th century, it's thought that generally the zenith of clearing had taken place, sometime in the 1830s-1840s, and the trees and the forests were essentially clear-cut, to an extent that is almost unbelievable. The London Olympics are about to begin, and spectators will again be riveted by feats that would have been impossible when the modern Olympics began in 1896. Jaw-dropping records are attainable in part because of advances in materials science. New materials have led to equipment like a super light and strong vaulting poles, and bathing suits that improve the flow of bodies in the water. Such developments are detailed in a series of articles in the journal Nature Materials. The scientists say other advances are afoot that build sensors into athletes' clothing for instance, measuring performance in training. Or protective gear that repairs itself when damaged. And advances in materials science can help Olympians internally as well. Elite athletes may tear cartilage or break bones. But cartilage doesn't have enough blood and cells to mend well, and sometimes bones just can't naturally bridge the break. So scientists are homing in on the best combinations of biocompatible materials, along with growth factors and other compounds, as well as implanted cells and proteins, to help mend what has been until now nearly intractable injuries. So that world-class athletes can push the limits of sports and science.
So a virus is something that you can't see by normal light microscopy. You need very advanced techniques for electron microscopy to see it. But that virus is not able to reproduce itself without a host, and us as human beings are made up of lots of different cell types, and we are interested in understanding at the molecular level how that virus infects the liver and why does it infect the liver and it doesn't infect the heart or it doesn't infect other tissues.
For some people, this proposition may seem far-fetched, but ending poverty is both morally necessary and actually feasible. All of us must play a role in making it happen. All human beings want, and have a right to live in dignity, to determine our own destinies, and to be respected by other people. Despite the universality of these rights, our capacities to fulfill them vary enormously, And no dividing line is more profound in influencing the quality of our lives than the gulf between poverty and prose and prosperity.
Watch for falling rocks. Those are words to keep in mind when you're driving a mountain road. Or, it seems, when you're cruising past a white dwarf star. White dwarfs are small, dense remnants of normal stars that have expended their fuel. Now researchers have identified rocky, asteroid-like material raining down on two white dwarfs. The rocky material is akin to the building blocks of planets, and its presence suggests that the two stars formed planetary systems before they expired and became white dwarfs. That's the conclusion of a study in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society. Astronomers identified the silicon-rich rocky material by training the Hubble Space Telescope on the nearby Hyades star cluster. Finding rocky material means the stars once had the raw ingredients to make exoplanets, although almost no known planets orbit stars inside of clusters. The discovery of planetary material thus raises more questions. Are star clusters indeed inhospitable to planets? Or are planets around stars in clusters for some reason just harder to spot? In the Hyades cluster, at least, it looks like there may be planets that have so far escaped our notice. Animal rights have been under intense debate on public domain since the 1970s. Thanks to the awareness generated by several NGOs, non-government organizations, like PETOR, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. According to one school of thought, zoos shouldn't be banned, but the animals should have freedom within zoos. But according to another school of thought, zoos should be banned as they violate animals' rights, and animals should be in their
The word science comes from a Latin verb meaning to know. Science is a way of knowing. It emerges from our curiosity about ourselves and our world. Striving to understand is one of our basic drives. Who are scientists? Scientists are people who ask questions about nature, and who believe these questions can be answered. Scientists are explorers who are passionate about
It is necessary that literacy should be taught at secondary school.
The campus tour will help you to get familiar with the teaching facilities.
Career services provide tips about how to cope with job interviews.